Hi class, welcome to chapter 14 of Patterns of State Formation in Africa between 600 and 1450 CE. Just like we did with chapter 12, I've broken this section up into two portions. First part relating to the information regarding Northeast Africa. And what you see here in this map, this is a depiction of what's called the Catalan Atlas, and this map was drawn of Africa showing the most wealthy king here of all time. This is Mansa Musa from Western Africa. So we'll get to this story, which is really fascinating and interesting, in the second PowerPoint regarding Africa. But we're first going to look at the role religion has played in Africa, looking mostly at Northeast Africa, then East Africa, and West Africa below the Sahara. So the first portion of this discussion this afternoon will be about Northeast Africa and focusing on what is the remnants of the Nile civilization, and looking at the Nubians, looking at Meroe, looking at new empires or kingdoms that arise in this place, in this time period of 600 to 1450. So what we want to look at is that the role of religion in the pattern it had in creating states within Africa. And while the Eurasian and North African patterns during this time period was out of formations of religious civilizations that contained commonwealths of states, the patterns here in sub-Saharan Africa in the same period was out of religious kingdoms and empires. In the northeast of sub-Saharan Africa, which is what this slide shows about, the kingdoms had already adapted to Christianity prior to 600, and the new kingdoms of Nubia and Ethiopia continued the Christian heritage. So we will be examining that throughout this PowerPoint. So let's get started. What we see here is Christian kingdoms in the northeast, and we see a church here that has been literally cut out and dug out from surrounding rock formations. And this is a stonemasons cut this church and its interior from the surrounding rock formations. This and 10 other churches built here in the early 1200s are part of a pilgrimage center created in the image of the Holy Land in Palestine. And you can see here in the background some housing. You can see the cross and the way it was dug out of the earth. You can see like rises here, people sitting and worshiping. So we see the beginnings, or not the beginnings, but the continuation of Christianity in Northeast Africa in this time period. What has allowed Christianity and helped Christianity come to this region is definitely the different transportation routes that have connected Northeast Africa with the larger Christian world of the Mediterranean. So we see camels were adapted for transportation in the Sahara region in the early centuries of the Common Era, and they created new nomadic powers that used camels for raids against different states. These camels also revolutionized commercial travel in the region, which helped it be connected to other parts of the world. Nomads defeated Meroe, which was already weakened by deforestation, and we covered that topic well back in part 2. But what we'll see here in part 3 is that the Nubians built 3 small kingdoms around 450 CE on the Middle Nile. And there were a number of villages increased with the use of animal-driven water wheel and better agriculture so they could sustain a larger population through increased productivity. Egyptian missionaries convert Nubia to Christianity by the 500s, and kings and elites sponsored church buildings and supplied churches with ritual objects and baptismal ritual objects that help, promote the faith. Nubian kings used Christianity to unify their subjects, and this was really something that helped create a single state religion. And we see this being a single state religion. This isn't just something that a small offshoot is doing. This is a statewide function. As Northeast Africa was predominantly Christian at this time, we see that there will be incursions and there will be fighting between the Arab empires that are to the north of Africa in the modern Middle East and the Mediterranean, and with the Christian area here in in northeast Africa. So in 652, Arab armies from Egypt attacked Nubia, damaging one of the capitals. Nubian archers, who were well known for their skill at archery, were able to defeat the Arab force and cause a retreat. What's interesting is at the end of this attack, the two sides signed an agreement formally recognizing the sovereignty of each other, and this agreement stopped the advance of Islam into northeast Africa for the next 600 years. During the 700s, a great king partially unified these three kingdoms of Nubia with his work. We're going to see that there's an attempt to break away from, and as I have it down here, Alexandria. The bishops were also independent of a king, and they were trying to appoint their own Coptic patriarch of Alexandria. What's happening here is that the control of trade, which is vitally important to this region, it's going to interconnect them with the Islamic world of this time period and the larger world to the east with India. And if you remember from this time period, what we just studied in chapter 12, is that the control of this trade is going to be very important, and it's going to also enrich in whoever controls it. So for this time, it's unclear if the king collected a tax, although he did control the trade routes. And we're going to take a closer look at those trade routes in a second. Agriculture was centered along the Nile Valley. As we've studied, this is an extremely fertile area of land. The two strips of arable land, about 2 miles wide on either side of the Nile, produces enough food to support this civilization. Annual floods from June to September covered them with fertile silt, which is the nutrient-rich dirt and sediment from the river, and it helped. When it flooded, it would overflow the banks and just fertilize the crops. Higher fields away from the banks were used for irrigation, and vineyards were important as wine became a key part of religious and social life now under a Christian civilization. Because of the Nile, the Nubian villages were largely self-sufficient and were able to support themselves during this time period. What is going to help connect them to these other parts of the world is this long-distance trade. Long-distance trade between 800 and 1200 brought Muslim merchants to northern Nubia. And we saw this. If you look here where it says to India, we're going to see the merchants that are part of the Delhi Sultanate, part of that region, trade along these well-established routes throughout the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa and the Indian Ocean. And these are going to bring Muslim merchants into contact with these villages and civilizations along the Red Sea and along Eastern Africa. As these Muslim traders are working in these regions, they will also be establishing a society. They'll also be building, necessary things. One of these is definitely the creation and the building of mosques in the region. Muslims brought a money economy to this area of the world. And as I mentioned earlier, this map shows the routes to India, and we'll see the routes from India and to India interconnecting these two parts of the world. The Nubian kingdoms disappeared in 1365, overrun by Arab incursions, and the process began in the 1100s as factions emerged between kings and northern rulers. Mamluk Egypt took advantage and installed a Christian vassal king, and eventually Christian vassal king was replaced by a Muslim king. And some historians question if the Nubian church had been a national church like those that we saw in Europe in our earlier chapter, last module. Could they have resisted the Muslim rulers and the change over time that occurred to this region being more Islamic than Christian, if the church had been a national church, not just an independent church? Something to ponder. And that's why the little smiley face with the pondering question mark there. Over time, we're going to see a number of kingdoms emerge slightly further south. And when we're talking further south, we're talking here with Axum, where modern-day Ethiopia is, and just a little bit further south here. We're going to look at some empires and kingdoms that pop up along this part of Africa. And we see that Axum has moved to the south and created a modest chiefdom around the 600s. partnered in the Red Sea trade with Muslim Egypt and African seaports. You see that interconnection with the trade, that is really part of its livelihood and helping it survive. Axum sent priests and settlers to convert the highlands to the south, and we're talking about Ethiopian highlands here. In the 970s, a southern queen led an army against Axum, and this army was filled with Africans who were subjected to conversion, so that were part of that Christian conversion. The church and monasteries were burned, and very little of Axum has survived today. So we're going to see already here by the 970s a move away from Christianity. Then we'll see that a new dynasty where modern-day Ethiopia or Abyssinia is located comes in, and it's a new stable kingdom, and it's Christian. In 1137, a king asked the metropolitan bishop to appoint 7 more bishops to this region. So they're going to, this dynasty in this area of the world in Ethiopia is going to be much more connected to the church in Europe. The king sponsored the buildings of churches out of subterranean rock, as we opened up the slideshow with, and the king continued to sponsor missionaries in the central and southern highlands. The king ruled by divine right, meaning that he was given the right to rule by God, but the kingdom was actually a federation of provinces, and this is going to play out. Farming plots consistently divided and reconstituted as both sons and daughters inherited equally. There's going to be this is going to be a long-standing Christian area of the world. The Solomons were a new dynasty of kings in 1270. They have a foundation narrative that traces their lineage back to Solomon. And outside of Africa, you've probably heard of this, the Solomons' heritage has been embraced by the Rastafarians, who are an Afrocentric Christian group. And this heritage, as you can see in this next map, it's all along this part of the green area. And there was an Ethiopian king led a Christian holy war against Muslim sultanates on the Red Sea in the 14th century. The conquered sultanates were left, they conquered a number of sultanates but left rulers as vassals, and they also adopted Christianized Roman law in the 1400s. So we're going to see a strong showing here of Christianity staying within this region for a number of years. The Solomons sent embassies to visit the Pope in Rome, and that's that connection back with the European churches. And then we've talked about this person before, this mythical person named Prester John. The Western Church identified Solomons with Prester John legend, and as you learned about him earlier, he was said to be a great Christian ruler in the East who was expected to come and aid the Crusaders in recovering Jerusalem. But by 1291, the Holy Land was lost, and John Prester was now said to be in Ethiopia, and there's going to be expeditions set out looking for him and trying to find him, and people will really try to connect with this legend and try to find him. So what we see in Africa, and specifically in Northeast Africa, which is this region here, is a connection to Christianity, and that the north part of Africa is going to definitely have a pattern of state formation that will embrace Christianity, that will try to resist the movement of Islam from coming southward, and they're going to connect themselves with the trade routes that we talked about of the Indian Ocean, and they're going to connect themselves also with the church, in the Christian church in Rome. The next PowerPoint will discuss the state formations in Western and Eastern Africa.